We all face challenges. Not a day goes by when we aren't faced with someone or something that can cause us to think a little differently, or that takes us by surprise. Some challenges arise because of our circumstance. Some challenges are imposed upon us. Some challenges are a consequence of our action, and others are presented to us by the people in our lives and the leaders we follow. The way we respond to a challenge, what we say and what we do, shows our character and turns people away or draws them near. And people made their way from villages all over to listen to what Jesus had to say. Jesus had many challenges presented to him by his detractors and adversaries, and they also came from the most unlikely of places. But what is it about the way Jesus responds to the different challenges set before him? He was not afraid to speak against the status quo, to act in a way that contradicted the accepted cultural norms, and so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that he would be challenged. But that didn't stop people wanting to come to listen to him. So on foot and by word of mouth, the news spread, and so they came to hear what Jesus had to say. When we think of those who challenge us, we often think of our modern-day adversaries, those who seem to do all they can to limit our best efforts to make an impact or to achieve certain outcomes. Throughout his mission, Jesus is confronted by many who challenged his claims, who questioned his authority, who sought to discredit his character. But not all of the people who challenged Jesus were actually his enemies. Some were very close to him, and indeed, some were his disciples. They asked their questions. It's as if they sat down to really think of how they could really get a deep answer out of him. There were questions that people asked about, who is my neighbour? And Jesus goes on to tell a story. And with the disciples, as well as with other people, there was a sense of the rhetorical, where Jesus was willing to not only listen to what the questions were, but ask questions back. And by asking questions back, so it was that the conflict, the opposition, if you like, that was mounting and building as you turn to the New Testament, as that was building, so they were able to work out for themselves what the real answers were to be. The challenges came to him at every quarter. Sometimes it was the challenge of sickness, of illness, of divisions in families. But you know, authority questions are always some of the most difficult. And Jesus had to face the conflict of disciples who had just not got it, because they had never really understood what Jesus meant when he talked about the first being last and the last being first, because they started to challenge him in terms of their own position, their own authority. Who's going to be the first in the kingdom? Who's going to have the best seats at the banquet? It must have been very, very hard to know that Jesus had selected and called these disciples. It's no wonder he needed time to be on his own, to be able to take all that in, to be able to understand it, so he could give the very best of the disciples. For the disciples were amongst the first to challenge him. They didn't seek to discredit Jesus. The challenge from the disciples came from their unbelief, their pride, and the questions that pertained to his death and resurrection. The word spread about Jesus throughout the Galilee. It caught the attention of the religious leaders. The Pharisees were the largest religious group in the Galilee, and the Sadducees and the Zealots, who had a greater influence in other parts of the country, opposed Jesus, though for very different reasons. Early on one occasion in Capernaum, 4 men brought a friend, a paralyzed man, and they brought him to Jesus. And to get to Jesus, they had to tear a hole in the roof of the house where Jesus was, so that he could be brought to Jesus for healing. And the heart of the problem, as far as the people who were plotting against him, was that Jesus healed people by offering forgiveness. Jesus brought new life to people by offering forgiveness. And forgiveness was, in the eyes of so many, seen as only something that God could deliver. Little did they know, of course, who it was that was offering this forgiveness. They were right in one sense, but wrong in so many other ways as well. So there was this sense of opposition that was real. And you can understand it because their authority seems to be being questioned. And of all the ways in which people's lives are challenged, when you question a person's authority, you really do make it very difficult for them to be able to engage in any real and meaningful way. Their authority is being questioned. It appears like a new teaching. It appears like a new authority, and it appears like a new power, even though Jesus so many times wanted to fulfill the law and do the things that were right. So when a person was healed, he told them, go and show yourself to the priest. Go and do what's right under the law if you're going to be healed in the fullest sense. But that wouldn't stop. Underneath the surface, a growing sense, a stirring sense of opposition. Jesus is opposed by the religious rulers because he challenged what they taught. By teaching that the kingdom of God is for everyone and speaking against the rules and traditions which excluded people from God's love. So religious people were trying to catch Jesus out. They were there all the time, watching what he was doing, listening to what he was saying. There were occasions when it was quite obvious that he was coming in a way against the accepted traditions of the day. Sabbath often centered around the debate because Jesus did things on the Sabbath that they would have never contemplated doing. But one thing that he did on the Sabbath that was very challenging was that he healed people on the Sabbath. Then there was another occasion when disciples were picking ears of corn in the field, and there was a discussion about whether this was right because it was on the Sabbath. Well, of course, it's much more than just about the picking of the hand. It's the whole process involved and what it leads to that becomes the point of conflict. And then there was an occasion, and this for me is a remarkable occasion, of a man with a shriveled hand, a withered hand, it tells us in some versions of the Bible, and came to Jesus. It's a Sabbath. It's in the synagogue, so it's in an important place. And he comes for healing. And Jesus actually asked the man to come and stand in front of people, so that before this happens, before he heals them, he challenges in a quite direct way. He challenges them about this healing. Is it good on the Sabbath to do good or evil? Well, of course, he's really now challenging. Who's going to stand up and say it's not right to heal the man? So he's really getting the wrong side of these religious people. From the outset and throughout his ministry, there was a growing sense of opposition to Jesus, his teachings and his methods, from the leaders of all religious groups, who each had their own claims on God to the exclusion of others, and who were so caught up in their interpretation of the laws that they overlooked or discounted the words and miracles that had taken place before them. There is no doubt that the crowds which followed Jesus were important to him, not only because the crowd would be the backdrop of so much of his teachings and examples, but because the crowd comprised of people, of individuals. And while there were people in the crowd who followed Jesus to hear him speak and receive healing, there were those who followed for other reasons. Whilst considering the challenges to Jesus, and there were many of them, you can't avoid talking about the crowd, because the crowd themselves become a body of power. The crowd around him would soon be motivated against him. But Jesus picked people out of the crowd. He noticed people. He noticed the children. He noticed individuals that had particular needs. He saw them, but he saw the crowd also. Not just as a body of people, he saw them. He saw them with compassion. He saw the crowd and the people in need as people who were sheep without a shepherd. This might properly lead us to the conclusion that those who followed Jesus were searching for spiritual purpose and meaning, and might easily have followed without question the teachings of other religious leaders, their interpretation of law, and the changing public opinion.
At times, Jesus would speak against the loud voice of the crowds and single out individuals.
We remember that on an occasion when there was a crowd there, Jesus called Zacchaeus, who was up a tree, a tax collector, to follow him by inviting himself for a meal at his house. Well, what did the crowds do? Well, they often listened to him because he taught with authority, not as other people did. They often applauded him. They wanted to give him accolade. So much accolade that on one occasion he wanted to get away from them because we're told they wanted to crown him king, and he wanted to get into the boat away from the crowd after feeding so many of them. But there were other occasions in which this crowd could become an angry crowd. There's no doubt that there was a crowd involved in the whole battle in Jerusalem, which was the crowd that was shouting perhaps for Barabbas rather than for Jesus.
The crowds that followed Jesus did not always comprise of the same people. The religious groups in the Galilee, for example, largely comprised of the Pharisees, while in Jerusalem it was the Sadducees. The crowds that gathered in the remote areas were different to the crowds by the mountainside, in the cities, or by the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. Different people would gather in different areas. And of course, Jesus always spoke his words, tailoring the message appropriate to the crowds and the people he was speaking to. Jesus was challenged by the disciples and those who were close to him. He was challenged by the religious rulers from all groups wherever he travelled, by individuals in the crowds and by the crowds as a whole. When confronted, Jesus always addressed the underlying issues that were presented before him. Having a public mission that spoke against religious traditions and many of the accepted customs of the day meant Jesus had to be ready for confrontation at all times and everywhere he went.
We're at the synagogue here. This is actually the ruins not of the original synagogue, but of the second synagogue built on the site. The first was the synagogue here in Capernaum, where Jesus visited, I'm sure, regularly. You could say it was his home church, his home synagogue. So when Jesus went to the synagogue, there's certainly something that is very, very special about that. First of all, he only did it because he had a welcome to go there. Remember, in Nazareth that happens. And when he spoke to them, he gave them a taste of what it is that he came to bring, even though people were observing and ready to go for him, to trip him up and to catch him out.
Synagogues were found in most towns and villages of the Galilee and provided a platform for teaching God's law. To many Jewish people, synagogues represent such an important part of their relationship with God. Not dissimilar, I suppose, in some ways to church buildings for many Christians, and were built on the highest points or on raised platforms so that they would be noticed by all. The synagogue buildings in the first century were a place of worship on the Sabbath and the centre of so much social education and community activity throughout the whole week. Jesus was most likely educated in a synagogue as a boy in Nazareth and continued his attendance as an adult in Capernaum. Jesus is recorded to have visited the synagogue on at least 10 separate occasions in towns and villages around the Sea of Galilee, and in Nazareth during his ministry, where he taught and brought healing. He was certainly active and well known in the synagogue community, and not afraid to debate and deliver how he understood Scripture. When this was not in line with current interpretations, he was not viewed favourably by some of the synagogue leaders.
On one occasion, in a synagogue setting such as this, Jesus had cast out an evil spirit, and people were mumbling between themselves and then spoke up the power and the religious authority to ask the question, by what power and authority have you done this? They'd missed out the real power of what he'd done and taught. They missed the good for all the messing about in the rules, the regulations and the authority. They'd missed the good he was doing. By what authority do you have? It was a point of conflict. It was certainly a place of misunderstanding, and it will become the ultimate challenge. The question, who is Jesus Christ? And by what authority have you got to do those things in our place?
The challenges presented to Jesus by the religious rulers and synagogue leaders questioned his teachings and authority and sought to discredit him and his teaching.
There was a developing sense of opposition. It was churning up under all that Jesus said and did. And one of the things that they wanted to do was turn his words, his ideas, his teaching upside down. But we must be very clear. Though this was Jewish leaders that were often engaged in this kind of opposition, this is not a Jewish problem. It's a problem in all organised religion, when people want to get a hold of something and use it for their own abuse and their own way. Carefully, they wanted to use him in his own words, and so he might be condemned in his own words. All the ideas about messiahship were now surfacing, and Jesus was not denying who he was. But the one thing that was true about Jesus was that he was so totally different than many of the concurrent ideas about messiahship. By the time of Jesus, they had developed in such a way as people perhaps saw the Messiah as one who could come and rise up and stir people up in opposition against the Romans and other authorities. But not Jesus. He was very, very different. There was a generosity about Jesus. There was an inclusiveness about Jesus in the way he treated people and groups of people. And certainly he was motivated by love, not by something that would be less than love. And that way of love was the way of the Messiah, and it was bound to cause a problem for all those who were beginning to oppose him.
Jesus didn't openly claim to be the Messiah, though he did receive Peter's confession in Caesarea Philippi, albeit that he told him not to talk about it at that time. He affirmed the identity as the Christ when questioned by the high priest during his trial. Despite this, his actions and all that he taught spoke clearly of a messianic authority. When he taught, he questioned some of the current interpretation and application of God's law, and this brought rise to his detractors and adversaries. When Jesus claimed to fulfill the law of the Old Testament, he was referring to the law that God gave to Moses. When speaking to his disciples, he brought context and meaning to this law. And when speaking with the religious rulers from their various groups, he was addressing their interpretation and application of God's law. And this contributed to their desire to plot against him, even eradicate him. It is important to recognise that not all of the religious rulers opposed Jesus. Many were amazed by his teachings and the wisdom with which he spoke. But Jesus certainly asked more questions than he answered, and people began to respond. Some became followers, some sought healing and wholeness, some realised their shortcomings and left despondent, while others undoubtedly felt threatened.
The opposition to Jesus, his adversaries if you like, were growing from the outset. At first they came from the synagogue. We're told in Mark's Gospel and elsewhere that they started to grow, the opposition against him. But it didn't just come from one quarter. Perhaps it came from disenchanted people who heard about Jesus and thought, oh, it's just another voice among the many voices clamouring for our attention, another religious voice. And then there were the religious leaders. They became adversaries because perhaps their power base was being threatened. So the opposition, the adversaries, didn't come from one source, but from many.
The challenges that Jesus had to deal with from his close followers and the religious rulers, irrespective of where he travelled, typically presented after a moment of high drama in his ministry. Perhaps the temptation of Jesus in the desert, immediately after his baptism and the affirmation as God's Son, provides an insight into the timing of the challenges that Jesus and his followers would have to face. The temptation experience is in stark contrast to his baptism and affirmation. After travelling with Jesus for some time and doing God's work, preaching and bringing healing in the towns and cities, Jesus takes Peter, James and John to the side of a high mountain, and something significant happens.
He is transfigured before them. Now the word is metamorpho in the original Greek. And the truth is that means something that is completely changed. It's where we get the word metamorphosis from. He is transfigured before them in such a way that he shone like white. It was such an amazing experience for them. And whilst he is in the middle of that experience and the disciples are caught up in what was happening, they're joining them on the mountainside are Elijah, and Moses. Now Elijah, if you like, represents the very height of the prophetic message, and of course Moses represents the law. So while they're on that mountainside, the voice from heaven is heard. The same voice that was heard at the baptism, in the same way, often known as the daughter of the voice. Behold, this is my son. And then finishing with that truth, listen to him. And at that moment, they fell down. We're told they fell down facewards. Well, you can imagine it, can't you? It was such a dynamic experience that they fell down faceward and they were told to get up. It's clearly a moment of call. It's a moment of call that it reinforces everything else that's happened. They've been called by the water in the Galilee. They have been called by what they have seen, by his words, by his message. But now there is an experience that will forever be theirs.
A moment of transformation in their lives as Jesus was transfigured before them. This was a significant moment for the disciples and also for Jesus. His identity and authority was reaffirmed and revealed to this select group of 3 disciples. They saw Jesus in something of the fullness of his purpose. It may well have given them insight into the future glory of his kingdom. This transfiguration experience will be later referenced by Peter as he continued teaching and preaching after the resurrection. But it was also a moment of contrast. After returning from the mountainside, the disciples began to argue about which of them was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So from the high point of the transfiguration, witnessed by Peter, James, and John on the mountainside, Jesus is forced to deal with his disciples, arguing about significance and pride. And he responds to the issue before him by challenging their perception of greatness, citing childlike obedience and humility, and saying whoever is the least will be the greatest. Another moment of contrast occurs at Caesarea Philippi. Beneath the carvings in the cliff face that represented the dominance and authority of ancient gods, and next to the place that was believed to be the gates of hell, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And God's Spirit reveals through Peter that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus then speaks to Peter, saying that his confession will be the rock on which he will build his church.
And when he leaves Caesarea Philippi, it's from that moment on that the gospel story dramatically changes, because Jesus says to them, to the disciples, that he's got to go to Jerusalem. And that means in our language and in the language of communication to the disciples that he would have to go there to suffer and to die, and gloriously for us through to resurrection. But when that story about him going to die becomes something Jesus articulates, Peter jumps in straight away and says, "Never." And what does Jesus say to him? Now, I think this is really one of the powerful moments in the story of Peter. He says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Remember, he just said to him at Caesarea Philippi, he just said, what you've discovered, you didn't discover it by yourself. And very quickly after that, he's having to say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And you know, that is the great dilemma that is there in Peter and in Jesus' ministry for the disciples.
So after the high moment of seeing Peter receive and respond to the revelation of God, Jesus is challenged and suggests that Peter is speaking the words of Satan, not of God. Perhaps Peter had an idea of what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah that suited his own understanding of God and which differed from Jesus' teaching and purpose. He didn't really understand that for Jesus to be the Christ meant that he must suffer and die for the sins of all people. This is such a contrast that speaks of an ever-present spiritual challenge that Jesus, and indeed all of his followers, must face. Throughout his ministry, Jesus challenged the interpretation of the law and the accepted customs and traditions of the day. In turn, he encountered challenges everywhere he went and in different forms. He was challenged by those who opposed him when his teaching and actions threatened the power base. But he didn't lose sight of his purpose. Jesus came to show God's love to all. he came to fulfill the law of the Old Testament. Jesus was also challenged by those closest to him when they didn't really get to understand his purpose. He brought God's kingdom to earth in a way that was most unexpected. He presented an understanding and demonstration of a God who cares for people, where love is the most important quality of all, and where his death would ultimately deal with human selfishness and wrong.
Why Jesus? Why didn't people ignore him? Why did they take him seriously? And what are the questions we should be asking today if we're going to take Jesus seriously?